If you want to record games from your Xbox or PlayStation in the highest quality, I'm talking 4K 60 FPS with HDR, and you want that in an external capture card, then you want the AVerMedia Live Gamer BOLT. So here's the box. Feel free to pause if you want to read this. Now, if all you care about is seeing samples of games recorded with this card, just look down to the description below for a short list of gaming videos that were captured with this card in both SDR and HDR, and usually at 4K 60 FPS. And also be sure to explore the SQ3X channel a bit more for loads of gameplay videos. I'm talking hundreds of hours of gaming videos that were recorded with the Live Gamer BOLT. In every gaming video, I'll list which capture card I used along with the settings in the description. All right, so just look down to the description to see if that video was recorded with the Live Gamer Ultra, the Live Gamer BOLT, or the Live Gamer Ultra 2.1. All right, let's pop open the box. There's the BOLT. Under this, you've got some included cables and some documents. This also comes with PowerDirector 15, so you can edit the game footage that you record. However, the free version of DaVinci Resolve is literally so much better, and that would be what I recommend that you get. And also, you have to understand that PowerDirector and the free version of DaVinci Resolve, and basically every other free video editor, will not export 10-bit HDR footage, at least in an MP4 container. Now, technically, you could export DNxHR-HQX in the free version of DaVinci Resolve, but that is going to be a massive file. I mean, 500 gigs, 800 gigs for just like an hour or two of gaming. Of course, you could compress it probably to, H.265, X.265 using Handbrake, which is also free, but that workflow is very complicated and time consuming. Okay, so if you're planning on recording and editing a bunch of HDR footage, you're going to be much better off purchasing a video editor that can handle the 10-bit footage. Now, I would suggest that you purchase the paid version of DaVinci Resolve, which is called DaVinci Resolve Studio, but you could also subscribe to Premiere Pro, or if you have a Mac, you could get Final Cut Pro. Although you should note that if you're going to use the BOLT on a Mac, that it doesn't support HDR recording in the first place, okay? And also the BOLT is only compatible with Intel-based Macs and not the new M1, M2, or M3 chip Macs. There's your HDMI 2.0 cable. And yes, this is an HDMI 2.0 device. If you want an external HDMI 2.1 device, in that case, you'd be looking at the new Live Gamer Ultra 2.1. Now, that is an awesome device as well. However, that device lacks HDR recording at 4K 60 FPS. All right. So we're going to have a full review of the Live Gamer Ultra 2.1 in the next video, so be sure to subscribe. There's an included audio cable that most people won't use, but hey, there it is if you want it, and a Thunderbolt 3 cable. The unit itself is built very well. The chassis is metal. The bottom is fully rubberized, so it won't slide around. There is a fan inside to keep it cool. It's also extremely quiet. You really can't even hear this thing. And there's a light bar on the front and around the bottom. All the connections are on the rear and clearly labeled, so it's simple to figure out where everything goes. Let's check the tech specs. Now, this is a Thunderbolt 3 device, so it must be connected to a Thunderbolt 3 or 4 port. You can't plug this in to USB ports, all right? The max pass-through resolution is 4K 60 frames per second with HDR, or 1080p at up to 240 frames per second. The max recording resolution is 4K 60 FPS, again with HDR. Of course, you don't have to use HDR with your 4K 60 recordings, but you absolutely can. Or if you want to do non-HDR, you can do 2K at up to 144 frames per second, or 1080p at up to 240 frames per second. Now that is insane. Again, the LGB does not support USB, and you must connect it to a Thunderbolt 3 or higher port. It also supports 7.1, 5.1 surround pass-through, and here's the system requirements for your computer. Note that your RAM must be DDR4 2400 or above. Now, the system I'm using is an Asus ROG Strix G16. It has an i9, RTX 4070, DDR5 RAM, and Thunderbolt 4. Great laptops. I'll be sure to have a link in the description below if you want to pick one up for yourself. I'll also be using this card connected to a Razer Thunderbolt 4 dock. However, if you experience dropped frames or other issues, You may need to unplug other devices from the dock or even connect the LGB directly to the Thunderbolt port, all right? Now, if you're gonna use the LGB with a Mac, as I've already mentioned, then take note that only Intel-based Macs are supported, and it's not going to work with your newer M1, M2, or M3 chip Macs. Also, as mentioned earlier, if you're gonna use this with a Mac, then HDR recording is not supported. So you probably shouldn't even consider this card if you're on Mac, okay? Because most people are gonna buy this for the HDR support. All right, so before we hook this up, we need to check what this screen is capable of connected directly to an Xbox, because sometimes these cards will remove features from your TV. So this TV is 60 Hertz, so therefore a max of 60 FPS, and it supports HDR10. All right, so we'll see if this changes after we connect the card. But first, come to the site, click Downloads, and download RECentral. You can also download the apps and drivers individually. If you're on Mac, of course, make sure you get the Mac version. Connect the Bolt to a Thunderbolt port, and you're not going to see any lights until you install the driver, all right? And then I'll just use RECentral to install the driver. Of course, you can manually download and install the driver individually if you prefer. All right, there we go. The driver is installed, and we now have lights on the unit. Now we can customize these lights in RECentral. You can even have the lights off or have a solid color, pulsing, blinking, scrolling, change the brightness and speed, etc., etc. Also, if you're using RECentral, the lights will turn red in pulse while you're recording and blue when you're streaming. Now that doesn't happen if you're using something like OBS. That only happens if you're using RECentral. Of course, you can also use OBS or Streamlabs or whatever you want, but RECentral will probably be the easiest one to use, especially if you've never used capture software before. You can literally just set it to optimal and it will automatically adjust all of the settings for you based on your computer and the video source. Or if you know what you're doing, you can head in there and set up your own recallable profiles so it's simple to switch between them. And if you want to record HDR, just click this button. Everything is switched over and you're good to go. Now, if you want to use something like OBS to record HDR, you can do that, but you're going to have to understand things like color formats and color spaces. All right, we're ready to connect our Xbox to the Bolt. So take the HDMI cable from your Xbox and plug it into the input. Then take another HDMI cable, plug it into the output, which is your pass-through, and connect it to your TV or monitor. And that's it. The card is connected to the computer, the Xbox, and the TV. It's passing everything through, and we can record the Xbox. Next, I'll check the TV details to make sure the card doesn't remove features from this screen. And we still have 4K, we still have 60 FPS, we still have HDR10, so everything looks exactly the same here. All right, so now we're ready to record or stream in stunning, super high quality 4K 60 FPS with HDR. So now I'll throw in a few gaming clips so you can see the quality in this video. But again, I would highly recommend that you browse the SQ3X channel for hundreds of hours of gameplay videos that were recorded with the Bolt. And if you want to specifically see HDR footage, there's really no way for me to show it to you in this video. So I'll have some specific HDR clips in the description below. Now you also have to understand that you won't see an HDR option on YouTube unless your screen supports HDR, okay? So if it does, you'll see the HDR tag. If it doesn't, then YouTube will convert the HDR clip to SDR. And that brings me to another question. Do you really need to record your games in HDR? And for most people, the answer is going to be a resounding no, okay? Especially after they understand how much harder it is to work with HDR footage versus SDR footage. You're going to have to know things like color depth, color primaries, color matrices, transfer functions, compatible containers and codecs, and the video has to be tagged with the proper metadata. Otherwise, YouTube won't render an HDR version. And many other video sites don't even accept HDR videos Or if they do, they transcode them to SDR anyway, and they end up looking awful. And you're also going to need a paid video editor that can work with 10-bit files. Now, maybe there's a free one out there that I don't know of that can work with 10-bit files, but you're going to be much better off by buying something like DaVinci Resolve Studio. You'll also have to get used to seeing videos that look super washed out, unless you have a proper calibrated HDR monitor and a 10 to 12-bit output from your computer. Now, this video file that you're seeing here, it's actually fine. It just looks totally washed out because the color space is set to the default Rec 709, and this is a non-HDR monitor. But once it's exported with proper settings and uploaded to YouTube, it's going to look just fine. Everything's going to look perfect. You can also check your files in VOC, as it will normally apply a LUT, or it will tone map the video in approximately the way that it's going to look on YouTube. Now, if you're not going to edit your video files, right, you're just going to record in HDR right from your Xbox or PlayStation or whatever, and then you're going to upload, that's fine. You won't have to do any extra work. If you're using RECentral with the HDR turned on, then that file is going to be tagged properly, and YouTube will transcode an HDR version. Now, for those of you who have never uploaded HDR to YouTube before, you'll probably be very surprised at how long it takes for an HDR version to become available. It can literally take a full day, 3 days, a week, or even longer before you see the HDR tag on your video. So don't freak out if you don't see it as soon as you publish. And again, your viewers won't see an HDR version if they don't have an HDR monitor. Instead, they'll see an SDR version that YouTube converted. And if you're streaming, to a site that doesn't transcode first, then your viewers that don't have an HDR monitor are going to see a really washed out looking video. Okay. Now, I'm not telling you all of this to dissuade you from buying the Bolt or from uploading HDR footage. You just need to be aware of the extra thought and work that goes into an HDR video workflow. Okay. And a tool that's going to help you with this, especially if you're new, to make sure you have the proper tags embedded in your video, is Media Info. This is a free tool, and I'll be sure to have a link to it in the description below. So we've been talking an awful lot about HDR, but of course you can record or stream in SDR as well. In fact, you're going to be using SDR the vast majority of the time. And as you can tell, the SDR footage looks just as stunning as the HDR footage. And we've also talked a lot about the positives of the Live Gamer Bolt, how it's really kind of the only external card, at least right now, that can do 4K60 with HDR 10-bit. Currently, nothing from Elgato can touch this. Maybe in February that will change. We'll have to see. Everything from the build quality to the capture quality of the Live Gamer Bolt is really second to none. It really is. I really love my Bolt. But there can be a few cons when using this card. Number one, it's a Thunderbolt card, and a lot of computers still don't have Thunderbolt ports. And while Thunderbolt is absolutely amazing for its speed and bandwidth, it's also a bit more prone to weird issues and driver conflicts versus USB. For example, the Thunderbolt port on this computer just stopped working completely, and it took me hours to trace it back to a new driver for the NVIDIA graphics processor. It was automatically installed. It was supposed to be installed because it was a new driver. You always want to keep your drivers up to date. But I had to switch it back to a different driver, and after that, bada bing, bada boom, the Thunderbolt started working again. So it's weird things like that where you can have a GPU driver that ends up affecting your Thunderbolt performance. I've also had a couple issues where RECentral would freeze during the recording and the video file would be corrupted, or you would record and the video file would have a bunch of stuttering. Now, this doesn't happen that often, maybe say 5 times in over 500 hours of recording, okay? So it's not likely to happen. And it's never happened to me while I was streaming, only when I was recording. And I really don't think that this problem is with the Live Gamer Bolt itself. I really think it has more to do with a Thunderbolt issue or maybe Windows Update caused some weird conflict, that eventually gets worked out, or it's an issue with RECentral because I've never had a freeze or stuttering when using OBS. Or it could be a problem with using a Thunderbolt dock, which pretty much everyone is going to use because most of our Windows laptops only have a single Thunderbolt port, and you're going to need that to power your external monitors, your external SSDs, etc., etc. So you probably won't have any of these issues. I just wanted to mention, from my personal experience. And lastly, for the cons there's latency. So anytime you put an extra device between your TV and console, there's going to be latency. That's just physics, okay? Now, it could be an undetectable fraction of a millisecond, right? Like if someone is, say, 5 feet away from you and they're talking, and then they move back 1 inch. Now, technically, they have increased the latency or the time it takes for those sound waves from their mouth to hit your ears. But does it make any difference? Of course not. You can't even detect it. Or it could be something like a controlled explosion where you're about half a mile away and you see the explosion, but you don't hear anything for 2.5 seconds, right? So that's latency that you can feel, latency that you wouldn't want. So AVerMedia says that the Live Gamer BOLT has a latency of about 50 milliseconds. Now, to put that in context with other devices, your TV probably has an input latency of about 15 milliseconds. So that means whatever's happening, let's say on your Xbox, you're not actually seeing that for 15 milliseconds, okay? And your wireless Xbox controller has about another 8 milliseconds of latency. If you're gaming online, then your internet connection can have 20, 30 milliseconds of latency, or even 115 milliseconds of latency. It really just kind of depends on your connection, all right? And all of these latencies can add up, and depending on who you are, you may be able to detect them. Now, they've actually done studies on gamers and input latency to see where it could be detected. And as you can see on the chart, the results are kind of all over the place. Now, you definitely want something that's under 100 milliseconds total for everyone, but some people may detect it at 20 or 40 or 80 milliseconds. It kind of just depends on who you are. And you can actually see the latency here. This was recorded at 60 frames per second, and you can see the computer and the TV, which is being fed the pass-through signal from the Xbox. Now, when I change pages, we see action on the computer screen about 6 frames before we see any movement on the TV. Now, 6 frames isn't that much. In fact, here's a video that's 6 frames. So in my experience, the latency really isn't an issue for the vast majority of games that are not online multiplayer, okay? The only time where I can feel something that's just a bit off is when I'm playing something like Fortnite, which is online. So it already adds a bit of latency from your internet, or maybe 30 to 40 milliseconds from the Fortnite servers, or you could be playing COD or other similar games. In that case, it did take me a couple of hours to adapt to the latency, but once I did, my win-loss ratio was exactly the same. But it is something that you may be able to feel on faster-paced games that maybe depend on precise timing, like Souls-like games, or when you're playing online fast-paced multiplayer games. Now, if you want a capture card that has basically a zero latency pass-through, then you'd go for the Live Gamer Ultra 2.1. But again, that card can't do 4K 60 FPS with HDR. It can do it without HDR, but not with HDR, okay? So that is the AVerMedia Live Gamer BOLT, a high-quality device, a premium device that gives you stunning quality recordings. And yeah, it does have a few quirks, but nothing too bad. And if you want that 4K 60 FPS HDR capture in an external unit, you don't really have a lot of options in that premium market. So this is definitely one that you would want to consider. And in the next video, we're going to review the amazing new Live Gamer Ultra 2.1. So you don't want to miss that. So be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out. All right. If you want to pick up either one of these devices for yourself, I'll be sure to have links in the description below.